22 years ago, in the summer of 1998, Michael Henderson vanished from his son's life without explanation, leaving behind only questions and a 12-year-old boy named David who would spend decades wondering what he had done wrong. The separation wasn't marked by death or tragedy in the traditional sense, but by something far more complex. Family secrets that tore through the Henderson household like a silent storm, scattering its members across different states and different lives. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. The last memory David Henderson had of his father was a heated argument between his parents in their modest home in Springfield, Illinois. Voices raised behind closed doors, followed by the sound of a suitcase being dragged down the stairs. By morning, Michael Henderson was gone, and David's mother, Sarah, refused to speak about it. "Your father had to leave," was all she would say, her eyes avoiding her son's desperate gaze. "It's better this way." What followed was a childhood marked by absence, empty chairs at birthday dinners, missed baseball games, and a silence that grew heavier with each passing year. David's questions were met with tight-lipped responses from his mother, who seemed to age years in the months following Michael's departure. Phone calls went unanswered, letters were returned unopened, and gradually David learned to stop asking. The official reason, the one his mother finally gave when pressed by well-meaning relatives, was that Michael had started over somewhere out west. But David knew there was more to the story. The way his mother's hands trembled when she spoke about it, the way she quickly changed the subject whenever someone mentioned his father's name. These weren't the reactions of a woman whose husband had simply decided to leave. They were the reactions of someone carrying a burden too heavy to share. As David grew into adolescence and then adulthood, the mystery of his father's disappearance became a defining element of his identity. He learned to navigate life without paternal guidance, to make decisions in the shadow of unanswered questions. College, career, marriage, the birth of his own children. All of these milestones were experienced with the persistent ache of incompleteness, the wondering about the man who should have been there but wasn't. The family's silence around Michael's absence created a kind of emotional archaeology in David's mind. He would find himself analyzing old photographs, searching for clues in his father's expression that might explain the sudden departure. He would drive past places they had visited together, the fishing spot by Miller's Creek, the diner where they used to get Saturday morning pancakes, hoping to unlock some memory that would make sense of the abandonment. But Michael Henderson hadn't simply walked away from his son. He had vanished into a different kind of existence, one that would keep him separated from David, not by choice, but by circumstances that neither of them fully understood at the time. The truth was more complicated than either abandonment or death. It was a story of miscommunication, pride, and the devastating way that family secrets can metastasize over time, creating distances that seem impossible to bridge. By 2020, David had constructed a life around his father's absence. He had become a successful software developer, married his college sweetheart Jennifer, and raised 2 children of his own. But the questions never stopped haunting him. During quiet moments, while helping his daughter with homework or teaching his son to throw a baseball, David would find himself wondering if his father ever thought about him. If somewhere in the vastness of America, Michael Henderson carried the same ache of separation that had shaped his son's entire adult life. The years between 1998 and 2020 had transformed David Henderson from a confused 12-year-old into a man who had learned to live with unanswered questions. But living with something and finding peace with it are entirely different experiences. Every Father's Day brought a familiar sting. Every family gathering highlighted the empty space where explanations should have been. David had become an expert at deflecting questions about his father, developing a repertoire of vague responses that satisfied casual acquaintances without revealing the depth of his uncertainty. His mother, Sarah, had taken her secrets to the grave in 2015, passing away from cancer without ever fully explaining why Michael had left or where he had gone. On her deathbed, when David finally pressed her one last time for the truth, she had gripped his hand with surprising strength and whispered, "He never stopped loving you. Remember that." But love without presence is a complicated gift, and David struggled to reconcile his mother's final words with the reality of 22 years of silence. The absence of closure had affected David's own parenting in ways both subtle and profound. He was hypervigilant about being present for his children, never missing a recital, always available for bedtime stories, coaching Little League with an intensity that sometimes surprised other parents. His wife, Jennifer, understood that his dedication stemmed from the wounds of his own childhood, but she also worried about the pressure he put on himself to be the father he had never had. "You don't have to be perfect," she would tell him when she found him reviewing his calendar obsessively, making sure he hadn't accidentally double-booked himself during one of the kids' events. "They just need you to be there." But being there felt like the bare minimum to David, who knew intimately the cost of absence. He carried the fear that something might happen to him, that his children might grow up with the same questions that had haunted his own development. The digital age had brought new possibilities for connection, but also new disappointments. David had spent countless hours searching social media platforms, typing variations of his father's name into search engines, hoping for some trace of Michael Henderson's existence. The problem with such a common name was that every search yielded hundreds of results. Michael Hendersons who were too young, too old, living in countries his father had never mentioned, working in fields that didn't match his memories. Each dead end felt like a small death, a reminder that some disappearances are more complete than others. Professional responsibilities had provided some distraction from the persistent questions. David's work in software development required intense focus, and he had found a kind of meditation in coding, the logical progression of problems and solutions, providing a stark contrast to the unsolved puzzle of his family history. His colleagues knew him as reliable, methodical, someone who could be counted on to see projects through to completion. They didn't know that his professional persistence was partly fueled by a desperate need to solve at least some of the problems in his life. But 2020 brought challenges that no amount of professional competence could resolve. The COVID-19 pandemic forced the world into isolation, creating a strange new landscape where human connection happened primarily through screens. David found himself working from home, conducting meetings through video calls, watching his children attend school through laptops. The technology that had once seemed cold and impersonal suddenly became the primary vehicle for maintaining relationships. It was during this period of forced digital intimacy that the boundaries between personal and professional life began to blur in unexpected ways. Conference calls that were supposed to focus on quarterly reports became informal check-ins about family well-being. Colleagues shared their spaces, their children appearing in backgrounds, their pets wandering through important presentations. The pandemic had stripped away many of the formal barriers that typically separated different aspects of life. David's company, a mid-sized tech firm based in Denver, had adapted quickly to remote work. The transition had been smoother than expected, with productivity actually increasing as employees saved commute time and worked in more comfortable environments. But the isolation was taking its toll in ways that weren't immediately visible in spreadsheets and performance metrics. Mental health had become a frequent topic of discussion, with management encouraging employees to take advantage of counseling services and flexible scheduling. March 15th, 2021, began like any other Monday during the pandemic. David Henderson sat in his home office in suburban Chicago, preparing for what should have been a routine quarterly review meeting with his company's West Coast partners. The coffee was still steaming in his favorite mug, a Father's Day gift from his daughter Emma that read, "World's Okayest Dad." and he was adjusting his webcam when the notification appeared on his screen, waiting for participants to join. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching us from and the exact time you're hearing this story. We're interested to know how far and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. The meeting was scheduled to include representatives from 3 different time zones, a logistical complexity that had become routine in the world of remote work. David was reviewing his notes when the first participant joined, a colleague from the Seattle office whose background showed a meticulously organized bookshelf. Then another joined from Los Angeles, her home office decorated with motivational posters and succulents. David was half listening to their small talk about weekend activities when the third participant's video loaded. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. The face that appeared on David's screen was older, marked by lines that hadn't existed in 1998, hair that had gone completely grey, but unmistakably familiar. The same deep-set brown eyes, the same slightly crooked nose from a childhood baseball injury, the same unconscious habit of rubbing his chin when thinking. Michael Henderson, now 68 years old, was staring back at his son through a computer screen, neither of them immediately comprehending what was happening. The professional context made the recognition even more surreal. Michael was listed in the meeting as Mike Henderson, Senior Consultant, with a company email address that provided no hint of the personal connection. He had been brought in to consult on a project that required his expertise in legacy systems. A cruel irony that his technical knowledge of old, outdated systems would be what brought him back into his son's life. For several seconds, neither man spoke. Their colleagues continued chatting about the agenda, unaware that they were witnessing a reunion 22 years in the making. David's hand moved instinctively toward his mouse, hovering over the Leave Meeting button, as every instinct told him to flee. But something deeper kept him frozen in place, perhaps the same stubbornness that had driven him to search for his father's name online countless times over the years. Michael's reaction was equally paralyzed. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, as if he were trying to speak but couldn't find words adequate to the moment. The professional mask he had worn for decades began to crack, revealing an expression of such raw vulnerability that it transformed his entire appearance. This wasn't the confident consultant who had joined the meeting. This was a father seeing his son for the first time in over 2 decades. The first words came from David, barely above a whisper, but clearly audible through his headset microphone. "Dad?" The question hung in the digital space between them, loaded with 22 years of absence, confusion, and longing. It was simultaneously the most natural and most impossible word David had ever spoken. Michael's response was immediate and devastating. "David. Oh my God, David." His voice cracked with emotion, and for a moment he looked as if he might cry. The other meeting participants had fallen silent, sensing that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. The awkwardness of the situation was compounded by the public nature of their reunion. This most private of moments was playing out in front of strangers who had logged in, expecting to discuss budget allocations and project timelines. I think there might be some confusion here," one of the other participants said diplomatically, clearly trying to give the 2 men space to process whatever was happening. But David couldn't look away from his father's face, couldn't stop analyzing the changes that 22 years had wrought. The grey hair, the deeper lines around his eyes, but also something else, a sadness that seemed to mirror his own. Could we have a moment?" Michael managed to say, his professional composure fighting against overwhelming emotion. This is my son. I haven't seen my son in 22 years. The admission hung in the air like a confession, transforming a business meeting into something sacred and terrible and necessary all at once. The other meeting participants disconnected quickly and tactfully, leaving David and Michael alone in the virtual space that had become the most significant room either of them had ever occupied. The silence that followed was dense with history. 22 years of missed birthdays, unanswered questions, and parallel lives that had continued in complete ignorance of each other. David's mind was racing, trying to process not just his father's presence, but the implications of how they had found each other. The randomness of it felt both miraculous and cruel. That after years of searching, after hiring private investigators in his 20s, after countless sleepless nights, wondering if his father was even alive, they would meet again through a work conference call about quarterly projections. "You look," Michael began, then stopped, his voice thick with emotion. "You look so much like your mother did at your age." The observation hit David like a physical blow, not because it was unkind, but because it revealed that Michael remembered Sarah, thought about her, carried mental images of their family that had presumably provided both comfort and torment over the years. "Where have you been?" David asked, the question emerging with more force than he had intended. It wasn't just about geography, though that was part of it, but about presence, about the 1,000 moments when a father should have been there, but wasn't. "I mean, I know you're in Seattle now, but where have you been all this time?" Michael's face contorted with what looked like physical pain. God, David, I've been everywhere and nowhere. I've been thinking about you every single day for 22 years. He paused, seeming to gather courage for what came next. "I've been living with the biggest mistake of my life, and I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if you'd even want to see me." The conversation that followed was disjointed, emotional, and absolutely necessary. David learned that his father had moved to Portland first, then Sacramento, then finally to Seattle. He had worked in tech consulting, never remarrying, living alone in a series of apartments that he described as temporary, even after years of occupancy. The temporary nature of his living situations seemed to reflect a deeper psychological state. A man who had never allowed himself to fully settle anywhere because he had left the most important part of himself behind. "I tried to come back so many times," Michael said, his image flickering slightly as his internet connection struggled with the emotional weight of the conversation. "I would drive to Illinois, get as far as Springfield, and then I would panic. I would think about how angry you must be, how much damage I had done by leaving, and I would turn around and drive back west." David found himself crying for the first time in years, not the controlled private tears he had shed at his mother's funeral, but the raw, unguarded sobs of the 12-year-old boy who had watched his father disappear. "I wasn't angry," he managed to say between breaths. "I was confused. I was scared. I thought I had done something wrong." No," Michael said firmly, leaning closer to his camera as if he could somehow reach through the screen to comfort his son. "No, David, you didn't do anything wrong. You were perfect. You were the best thing in my life, and I threw it away because I was a coward." The word coward hung between them, and David could see that his father had been carrying this self-assessment for decades. But knowing that his father regretted the decision didn't immediately heal the wounds that 22 years of absence had created. There was too much time to account for, too many missed opportunities to simply forgive and move forward. "Why didn't you ever call?" David asked, "or write, or anything? Mom died 5 years ago, and she never told me why you left or where you went. I didn't even know if you were alive." Michael's composure finally broke completely. "Sarah's dead?" The question was barely a whisper, and David realized with a shock that his father had been carrying an image of his family frozen in time from 1998. In Michael's mind, Sarah was still the 40-year-old woman he had left behind, and David was still the 12-year-old boy who had needed his father's guidance through adolescence and into adulthood. The revelation that Sarah had died seemed to age Michael visibly during the call. His shoulders sagged, and he put his head in his hands for a long moment before looking back at the camera. I hoped that maybe someday I could explain to both of you. I thought I had time to make it right." "She never stopped wearing her wedding ring," David found himself saying, though he wasn't sure why he chose to share this detail. Even after you left, even when people asked if she was dating anyone, she would just say she was still married. As the initial shock of recognition began to fade, the conversation between David and Michael shifted into deeper, more painful territory. The question that had haunted David's entire adult life finally found its voice. Why did you leave? What happened that was so bad that you couldn't even say goodbye? Michael's answer came slowly, as if he were excavating memories that had been buried for decades. Your mother and I, we had problems. Financial problems, mainly. I'd made some investments that went bad, really bad. I lost our house, David. I lost everything we had saved for your college fund, for our retirement. I was drowning in debt and I was too proud to tell anyone how bad it had gotten. The confession hit David with unexpected force. He had imagined dozens of reasons for his father's departure over the years. Another woman, dissatisfaction with family life, a midlife crisis that required geographical escape. But financial problems seemed simultaneously more mundane and more devastating than the dramatic scenarios his imagination had created. But people lose money all the time, David said, struggling to understand how financial difficulties could justify abandoning a family. You could have talked to us. We could have figured it out together. Michael's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. You were 12 years old, David. You shouldn't have had to figure out your father's failures. And your mother, she had already sacrificed so much to support my dreams, my business ventures that never worked out. I couldn't ask her to watch me fail again. The story that emerged over the next hour was one of masculine pride turned toxic, of a man who had defined himself so completely by his role as provider that he couldn't imagine continuing to exist in his family's life once he could no longer fulfill that function. Michael had been struggling with a failed business venture, mounting credit card debt, and the approaching foreclosure of their family home. Rather than face the shame of admitting his failures to his wife and son, he had chosen the more dramatic option of disappearing entirely. I thought I would leave for a few months, Michael explained, his voice heavy with regret. I thought I would go somewhere, start over, make enough money to pay back the debts, and then come home like some kind of hero. I had this fantasy that I would surprise you both with a solution to all our problems. David felt a complex mixture of anger and pity as he listened to his father's explanation. The selfishness of the decision was clear. Michael had chosen his own emotional comfort over his family's need for honesty and unity in facing their challenges. But there was also something tragically familiar about the pattern of masculine shame that had driven his father's choices. What actually happened? David asked. I mean, obviously you didn't make a fortune and come back as a hero. Michael's expression grew even more pained. I spent the first year in Portland, working construction and living in a motel. I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I was just getting on my feet, but every month that passed made it harder to come back. How do you explain to your wife and son that you've been hiding in Oregon for a year instead of facing your problems? The psychology of the situation was becoming clearer to David. His father had trapped himself in a cycle of avoidance that grew stronger with each passing month. The shame that had driven him away initially had been compounded by the shame of staying away, creating a psychological prison that had lasted for over 2 decades. I kept tabs on you both, Michael continued. Not directly, but through mutual friends, through social media once that became a thing. I knew when you graduated high school, when you went to college, when you got married. I've seen pictures of your children, David. I have a granddaughter and grandson that I've never met. This revelation was almost as shocking as the initial reunion. David had assumed that his father's absence was complete, that they had become strangers living in parallel universes. But Michael had been watching from a distance, a ghost haunting the edges of his family's life through digital channels and second-hand information. "You've been stalking us?" David asked, and immediately regretted the harshness of the word. "No," Michael said quickly, "not stalking, just trying to stay connected to the only thing that ever mattered to me. trying to make sure you were okay, that you were happy, that you didn't need me to intervene in some emergency. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on David's office door. His daughter Emma, now 16 and home from school due to another COVID lockdown, poked her head into the room. "Dad, Mom wants to know if you'll be done with your meeting soon. Dinner's ready." David looked at his father's face on the screen, then at his daughter in the doorway, and felt the full weight of generational impact. Emma had grown up with a present, involved father precisely because David had experienced the pain of an absent one. But she had also grown up without knowing her grandfather, without the benefit of extended family connections that other children took for granted. "Emma," David said carefully, "this is going to sound strange, but I'd like you to meet someone. This is your grandfather, my dad." Emma's reaction to meeting her grandfather through a computer screen was markedly different from her father's earlier shock. Born into the digital age, she had grown up understanding that meaningful relationships could exist through screens, that FaceTime calls with distant relatives were normal, that physical presence and emotional connection didn't always require the same space. If this case has already gripped you, leave that like. It helps the story of Michael Henderson reach more people. "Wait, what?" Emma said, stepping fully into the room and looking between her father and the screen. "This is Grandpa Mike, the one who's been away?" David had never hidden his father's absence from his children, but he had framed it in terms they could understand at their respective ages. To Emma, her grandfather had been a figure from stories, someone who existed in the abstract realm of family history rather than present reality. Michael's face transformed when he saw his granddaughter. The years of self-imposed isolation, the weight of shame and regret, seemed to lift momentarily as he took in Emma's features. The Henderson chin that had passed through 3 generations, the same quick, intelligent eyes that David had possessed as a child. "Hello, Emma," Michael said, his voice soft with wonder. "You're even more beautiful than in the pictures You look just like your father did at your age." He caught himself, realizing that admission revealed the extent of his distant observation of their family. Emma, with the directness that teenagers often possess, asked the question that had been hovering unspoken. "Are you going to disappear again?" The question was delivered without malice, but with the practical concern of someone who had grown up understanding that adults sometimes made choices that didn't make sense to children. The directness of the question seemed to catch Michael off guard. He looked at David, then back at Emma, and David could see his father wrestling with how to answer honestly without making promises he might not be able to keep. "I hope not," Michael said finally. "I don't want to. I've missed so much of your dad's life, and I've missed getting to know you and your brother. But I understand if you need time to decide whether you want me to be part of your lives." David found himself stepping into the role of mediator, trying to navigate between his daughter's natural curiosity and his own still raw emotions about his father's reappearance. "Emma, this is all very new for everyone. Why don't you go tell Mom what's happening, and maybe we can all talk about it together after Grandpa Mike and I finish catching up?" After Emma left, the conversation between father and son took on a different quality. The presence of the next generation had shifted something fundamental. This was no longer just about their relationship to each other, but about their roles as links in a family chain that extended beyond their individual pain and reconciliation. "She seems incredible," Michael said once they were alone again. "Smart, confident. You've done an amazing job raising her." "Jennifer and I," David corrected, though he appreciated the compliment. "And I had help from Sarah. Mum was incredible with the kids before she got sick." The mention of Sarah brought them back to the weight of time lost, of the finality of death that made some reconciliations impossible. "Tell me about her," Michael said quietly. "Tell me about Sarah's last years. I know I don't have the right to ask, but..." David found himself sharing stories about his mother's final years, her battle with cancer, her determination to see Emma graduate from middle school, her quiet strength in facing mortality with dignity. As he spoke, he watched his father's face and saw the accumulation of grief that comes from learning about loss secondhand, from missing the opportunity to offer comfort or share the burden of saying goodbye. "She talked about you sometimes," David found himself saying, though he wasn't sure why he chose to offer this kindness. "Especially near the end. She would say that you were a good man who made a terrible mistake and that she hoped someday you would find your way back to us." Michael's reaction was immediate and overwhelming. He covered his face with his hands and wept openly, the sound of his grief carrying clearly through the computer speakers. David sat watching his father cry for the first time in his memory, feeling a complex mixture of compassion and anger, forgiveness and resentment. When Michael finally composed himself, he looked directly into the camera with an expression of desperate sincerity. "David, I know I can't undo the damage I've done. I know I can't get back the time I lost with you, with Emma, with your son. But I want to try to be better. I want to try to be the father and grandfather I should have been all along." The conversation was interrupted by David's phone, buzzing with a text from Jennifer. "Emma told me what's happening. Are you okay? Do you need me to get the kids out of the house so you can process this privately?" David looked at the message, then at his father's face on the screen, and made a decision that surprised himself. "Actually, would you like to meet Jennifer and my son Tyler? I mean, if you're ready for that. If this is real and not just, I don't know, some kind of digital hallucination." Michael's smile was the first genuinely happy expression David had seen from his father in their entire conversation. "I would love that more than anything." The next hour unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance of emotions, with Jennifer taking the lead in facilitating introductions that felt both momentous and surprisingly natural. As a social worker, she had professional experience helping families navigate complex emotional terrain, but this was also deeply personal, meeting the man whose absence had shaped her husband's entire approach to fatherhood. Tyler, at 14, was more reserved than his sister had been. He hung back slightly when David called him into the office, his natural teenage skepticism heightened by the unusual circumstances. Unlike Emma, who had grown up hearing stories about her missing grandfather, Tyler had shown little interest in family history, preferring to focus on his immediate world of friends, video games, and soccer practice. "Tyler, this is your grandfather," David said, his voice still carrying traces of the emotional exhaustion from the previous hours of conversation. "My dad, Michael Henderson." Tyler nodded politely but said nothing, studying his grandfather's face with the analytical gaze that he typically reserved for opposing soccer teams. Michael seemed to understand that he would need to earn his grandson's trust rather than expect it to be automatically granted. "I hear you play soccer," Michael said, clearly having done his homework through whatever distant observation methods he had been using to track his family's lives. "Your dad was on his high school team. Not very good, but enthusiastic." This drew a slight smile from Tyler and a mock-offended protest from David. "Hey, I scored 3 goals my senior year." The moment of levity was brief but significant, the first indication that normal family interaction might be possible despite the extraordinary circumstances of their reunion. Jennifer's introduction was more complex. As David's wife of 15 years, she had lived with the impact of his father's absence in intimate ways. She had watched David struggle with Father's Day, had seen him overcompensate with their own children, had been the one to comfort him after his mother's death, when the finality of never getting answers about his father's disappearance had hit him hardest. "I've heard a lot about you over the years," Jennifer said to Michael, her tone carefully neutral. "David has wondered about you almost every day since we've been married." Michael's response was immediate and direct. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness or your understanding. I know that my decision to leave didn't just hurt David. It hurt everyone who loved him and had to watch him carry that pain. I'm sorry, Jennifer. I'm sorry for the burden that my cowardice placed on your marriage and your family." The apology was unexpected in its specificity and its acknowledgement of the ripple effects of his decision. Jennifer seemed surprised by his insight into the broader impact of his absence, and David could see her professional assessment skills being applied to her father-in-law's emotional intelligence and sincerity. "The kids don't know any different," Jennifer said carefully. "They've grown up with just one set of grandparents, and they're well-adjusted and happy. Whatever happens next, their emotional well-being has to be the priority." "Of course," Michael agreed immediately. "I don't want to disrupt their lives or create confusion. I hope that maybe there's room for me to be part of their future, even if I can't change their past." The conversation was moving toward practical considerations. How to maintain contact, whether Michael might visit Chicago, how to explain the situation to extended family members who had written him off decades ago. But David found himself overwhelmed by the speed at which his life was changing. 24 hours earlier, his father had been a ghost, a source of unresolved grief and unanswered questions. Now he was a real person, sitting in what appeared to be a modest apartment in Seattle, expressing genuine remorse and asking to be part of their lives. "I need some time," David said suddenly, interrupting a discussion about weekend video calls. It's a lot. I need to process what this means before we make any plans about the future." Michael's face showed disappointment, but also understanding. "Of course you do. David, take all the time you need. I've waited 22 years to have this conversation. I can wait as long as you need to decide what comes next." Jennifer stepped in with practical concerns. "What about work? I mean, you two are going to be on the same consulting project, right? Is that going to be awkward?" The question brought them back to the surreal nature of their reunion, that they had found each other through professional rather than personal channels, that they would presumably need to continue working together while navigating their personal relationship. David hadn't considered the practical implications of having his father as a colleague. "We can handle that professionally," Michael said. "If it makes David uncomfortable, I can ask to be reassigned to a different project. The last thing I want is to create workplace stress for him." David found himself appreciating his father's consideration of practical details, while also feeling frustrated by the careful politeness of their interaction. Part of him wanted to scream, to demand more dramatic expressions of regret, to insist on grand gestures that might somehow compensate for decades of absence. But another part of him recognized that healing, if it was possible at all, would probably happen through exactly these kinds of small, considerate decisions. "Let's see how it goes," David said finally. "We're adults. We can separate personal and professional issues if we need to." As the extended family meeting wound down, with Emma and Tyler heading back to their homework and Jennifer going to clean up dinner, David found himself alone with his father again. The same digital space where their reunion had begun hours earlier, but with a completely different emotional landscape. The weeks that followed their reunion were marked by a careful dance of connection and distance, as David and Michael navigated the complex process of rebuilding a relationship that had been interrupted for over 2 decades. They established a routine of weekly video calls, always scheduled and formal, as if spontaneous contact might be too dangerous for their still fragile reconnection. During these conversations, they began to fill in the enormous gaps in each other's lives. David learned about his father's years of solitude, the various cities where he had lived, the jobs he had taken to survive rather than thrive. Michael had become an expert in legacy computer systems because he had been working with outdated technology for decades, unable to afford upgrades, using his expertise with old systems as a kind of professional niche. "I never bought anything new," Michael explained during one of their calls. "Not furniture, not cars, not computers. I lived like I was temporarily broke for 22 years, always telling myself that I would invest in a real life once I figured out how to come home." David found these details both heartbreaking and frustrating. The picture that emerged was of a man who had punished himself continuously for a single decision, who had chosen self-imposed exile over the messy work of facing his mistakes and rebuilding his family relationships. There was something almost selfish about the completeness of Michael's self-sacrifice, as if his suffering somehow absolved him of the more difficult task of staying present for the people who needed him. The professional relationship between father and son proved to be less awkward than expected. In work meetings, they maintained careful boundaries, addressing each other formally and focusing strictly on technical issues. Their colleagues gradually became aware that they were related, but the professional context provided a useful framework for interaction that didn't require immediate emotional processing. Emma and Tyler's relationships with their grandfather developed along different trajectories. Emma, naturally curious and emotionally intuitive, embraced the weekly video calls and even initiated text conversations with Michael about school and friends. Tyler remained more cautious, participating in family calls but rarely engaging in one-on-one communication with his grandfather. "He's protecting himself," Jennifer observed during one of her conversations with David about the situation. "Tyler's old enough to understand that adults can disappear from your life suddenly, and he's not ready to invest emotionally in someone who might leave again." Jennifer's own relationship with Michael was cordial but guarded. She participated in family video calls and answered his questions about her work and interests, but David could tell that she was reserving judgment about his father's long-term commitment to rebuilding family relationships. Her protective instincts toward David and the children were evident in the way she monitored the emotional temperature of their interactions. The question of whether Michael would visit Chicago became a recurring theme in their conversations. He expressed interest in meeting his grandchildren in person, in seeing where David lived, in somehow making his presence more concrete than pixels on a screen. But the logistics of such a visit felt overwhelming to everyone involved. The potential for disappointment if the in-person meeting didn't live up to expectations, the pressure of compressed time to cover decades of missed connection. "I don't want to impose," Michael said repeatedly when the subject came up. "I don't want to disrupt your normal routine or create stress for the kids." But David could hear the longing in his father's voice, the desire to inhabit the same physical space as his family, to prove that he was real and committed to staying in their lives. David's own feelings about a potential visit were complicated. Part of him wanted to maintain the safety of digital connection, where he could control the duration and intensity of their interactions, where he could end a conversation if it became too emotionally difficult. But another part of him needed to see his father in 3 dimensions, to hug him or shake his hand, or simply exist in the same room, breathing the same air. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult week, in May 2021, when David was struggling with a challenging project at work and Tyler had been injured during a soccer game. The combination of professional stress and parental worry had left David feeling overwhelmed, and during their weekly call, he found himself being more honest than usual about his emotional state. "I keep thinking about how different things might have been if you had stayed," David said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "Not just for me, but for Mom, for the kids. They would have had 2 sets of grandparents instead of 1. Mom wouldn't have had to handle everything alone when I was a teenager." Michael's response was immediate and direct. "David, I want to come to Chicago. I want to meet Tyler and Emma in person. I want to see where you live, meet your neighbors, understand the life you've built. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of your present if you'll let me." The invitation, when David finally extended it, felt like stepping off a cliff. "Okay," he said simply. "Come for a weekend. Let's see what happens." The morning of June 12, 2021, marked exactly 23 years since Michael Henderson had last set foot in Illinois. David stood in the baggage claim area of O'Hare Airport, scanning the faces of travelers emerging from the secure area. His heart rate elevated in a way that reminded him of job interviews and first dates. That particular anxiety that comes from knowing that the next few minutes might change everything. When Michael appeared, walking slowly and carrying a small duffel bag, David's first thought was how much older his father looked in person than he had on video calls. The camera had somehow softened the lines around his eyes, had hidden the slight stoop in his shoulders that spoke of decades of carrying invisible weight. But there was also something more vital about his presence, a nervous energy that suggested he understood the significance of this moment as clearly as David did. Their embrace was awkward at first, the physical reality of contact after 23 years of absence, feeling simultaneously foreign and familiar. Michael was thinner than David remembered, his frame smaller somehow, but his scent was exactly the same. A mixture of aftershave and coffee that transported David instantly back to childhood memories of Saturday morning fishing trips and bedtime stories. "You made it," David said unnecessarily, stepping back to look at his father's face in natural light rather than through a computer screen. "I made it," Michael confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for letting me come home." The drive from the airport to David's house in the suburbs was filled with the kind of conversation that happens between people who are trying to fill enormous gaps in shared experience. Michael commented on how much Chicago had changed, on new buildings and highways that had been constructed during his absence. David found himself playing tour guide to his own life, pointing out his children's schools, the grocery store where his family shopped, the park where Tyler played soccer. Jennifer and the children were waiting in the living room when they arrived, arranged with the careful casualness of a family portrait. Emma bounced up immediately to hug her grandfather, her natural warmth overriding any awkwardness about meeting someone she had only known through screens. Tyler remained seated, but offered a polite handshake when Michael approached him. "Your house is beautiful," Michael said, looking around at the comfortable chaos of family life. Soccer cleats by the door, Emma's art projects covering the refrigerator, photos documenting birthdays and holidays, and ordinary moments that had accumulated over the years of his absence. Over the next 3 days, Michael was integrated into the rhythms of their daily life with surprising ease. He attended Tyler's soccer game, cheering from the sidelines with the enthusiasm of someone making up for years of missed opportunities. He helped Emma with a history project about World War II, sharing stories about his own father's military service that added personal context to textbook facts. He cooked breakfast for the family on Sunday morning, using a recipe for pancakes that David remembered from childhood. But the visit also highlighted the complexity of attempting to rebuild relationships across such a significant gap in time. Michael's references were often dated, his understanding of current technology limited, his knowledge of his grandchildren's interests superficial despite his years of distant observation. There were moments of awkward silence, failed attempts at jokes that landed flat, conversations that revealed how much they still didn't know about each other. The most significant moment came on Saturday evening, after Emma and Tyler had gone to bed and Jennifer had tactfully excused herself to give father and son some privacy. David and Michael sat on the back deck, sharing a beer and watching the sun set over the suburban landscape that represented everything Michael had missed during his years of exile. "I need to ask you something," David said finally, breaking a comfortable silence, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." Michael nodded, bracing himself for whatever question had been building in his son's mind. "Are you going to stay this time? I mean, really stay? Because if you're going to disappear again, I need to know now. My kids are starting to get attached to you, and I can't let them go through what I went through." Michael's answer came without hesitation. "David, I swear to you on everything that matters to me, which is you and Emma and Tyler and Jennifer, I am never leaving again. I may die, I may get sick, I may face problems that require your help to solve, but I will never again choose to walk away from this family." The promise felt substantial, weighted with the understanding of what his previous absence had cost everyone. But David also recognized that promises, no matter how sincerely made, would need to be proven through sustained action over time. "I want to believe you," David said, "but I also need you to understand that trust has to be rebuilt slowly. You can't just erase 23 years with one weekend visit." "I know," Michael said. "I'm prepared to spend however long it takes, proving that I mean what I say. I'm prepared to be patient while you decide whether you can forgive me." As the weekend concluded and Michael prepared to return to Seattle, the family stood in the driveway for goodbyes that felt both final and provisional. Emma hugged her grandfather tightly and made him promise to text her during his flight. Tyler offered another handshake, but this time it was accompanied by a genuine smile and a request that Michael attend his next soccer game via video call. Jennifer's goodbye was perhaps the most significant, a warm hug and a quiet, "Thank you for coming," that suggested she had seen enough during the visit to believe in Michael's sincerity, even if she remained cautious about the future. David's goodbye to his father was the most complex. A mixture of gratitude for the courage it had taken to make the visit, hope for continued connection, and the persistent underlying fear that this might still somehow be temporary. "I'll call you when I get home," Michael said as he got into his taxi to the airport. "I'll be waiting," David replied, and meant it. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases. Thank you for following Michael Henderson's story. See you in the next video. 4 years have passed since that extraordinary March morning when a routine business meeting became the catalyst for healing a family fractured by decades of silence. The Henderson family's story, which began with abandonment and shame, has evolved into something more complex and ultimately more hopeful, a testament to the possibility of redemption, even when it comes later than anyone would have chosen. Michael Henderson kept his promise. In the months following his visit to Chicago, he made the decision that would have seemed impossible just years earlier. He sold his sparse apartment in Seattle and moved to a modest 2-bedroom house just 20 minutes from David's suburban home. The transition wasn't seamless. Michael had to rebuild not just relationships, but an entire life infrastructure that he had kept deliberately minimal for over 2 decades. The process of integration required patience from everyone involved. Michael struggled with the basics of establishing himself in a community, opening a local bank account, finding a primary care physician, learning the names of his neighbors. For someone who had lived like a ghost for so long, becoming a visible member of society again required conscious effort and occasional guidance from his son. David watched his father's reintegration with a mixture of admiration and protective skepticism. The weekly video calls evolved into regular in-person visits, then into spontaneous drop-ins for dinner or help with household projects. Michael became a fixture at Tyler's soccer games, his cheers distinct among the parent crowd, making up for lost time with the enthusiasm of someone who understands that every moment of presence is a gift. Emma, now 20, maintained the closest relationship with her grandfather throughout college. Their text conversations evolved into regular phone calls about everything from academic stress to relationship advice. Michael's perspective, shaped by decades of solitude and regret, often provided her with insights that differed markedly from her parents' more conventional guidance. She would later describe their relationship as catching up on 20 years of grandfather-granddaughter conversations in 4 very intense years. Tyler's acceptance of his grandfather was more gradual, but ultimately more profound. As he matured from 14 to 18, he began to understand the complexity of adult decisions and failures in ways that allowed him to see Michael not just as an absent figure from family history, but as a flawed human being trying to make amends. Their relationship developed around shared activities, fixing cars, home improvement projects, and long conversations about the pressure young men face to define themselves through their achievements. Jennifer's role as the family's emotional architect became crucial during these years of rebuilding. She helped establish boundaries that protected everyone's well-being while allowing space for genuine connection to develop. Her professional background in social work proved invaluable in navigating the complex dynamics of reintegration, and she often served as translator between David's sometimes overwhelming emotions and Michael's careful attempts to prove his commitment. The financial legacy of Michael's original decision also required addressing. During his years of exile, he had lived so spartanly that he had accumulated modest savings despite his lower income jobs. He insisted on contributing to Emma's college expenses and Tyler's various activities, not as a gesture of guilt-based compensation, but as a grandfather's natural desire to support his grandchildren's futures. David initially resisted these contributions, but eventually came to see them as part of Michael's process of reclaiming his role in the family. Perhaps most significantly, Michael's return allowed for conversations about Sarah that had been impossible during her lifetime. David learned details about his parents' early relationship, about his mother's dreams and fears, about the depth of love that had made Michael's abandonment so devastating for her. These conversations were often difficult, but they provided David with a more complete understanding of his family history and his mother's experience. The COVID-19 pandemic, which had facilitated their initial reunion through remote work technology, continued to shape their relationship in unexpected ways. When travel restrictions and health concerns made traditional holiday gatherings complicated, the Henderson family adapted by creating new traditions that accommodated everyone's comfort levels. Michael learned to use technology not just for work, but for maintaining daily connections with his family in ways that felt natural rather than obligatory. Michael's relationship with his grandchildren became a source of particular healing for him. Through Emma and Tyler, he experienced the uncomplicated love that he had forfeited with David, not because his grandchildren were unaware of his history, but because they had no personal experience of his absence to overcome. Their acceptance of him was based entirely on his present behavior rather than his past failures, offering him a kind of redemption that felt both earned and freely given. The professional relationship between David and Michael also evolved during these years. They completed several successful projects together, with colleagues noting their effective collaboration and complementary skills. Working together provided them with a shared context outside of their family dynamics, allowing them to see each other as competent adults rather than just wounded father and son. Michael's expertise with legacy systems became metaphorically appropriate. He had become an expert at helping organizations maintain connections with their outdated but still valuable infrastructure. David's own parenting was profoundly affected by his father's return. The hypervigilance that had characterized his early years as a father began to relax as he witnessed Michael's consistent presence in their lives. He learned to trust that his children could form relationships with their grandfather without requiring constant parental oversight, and he began to understand that his own worth as a father wasn't defined by his ability to compensate for his father's past absence. By 2025, Michael Henderson had become an integral part of his family's daily life in ways that felt both remarkable and completely natural. He attended school events, provided childcare during family emergencies, and served as the family's unofficial technology support when his years of working with computers proved useful for more than just professional consulting. The transformation wasn't complete. There remained moments of awkwardness, references to shared experiences that didn't exist, and the occasional reminder that 23 years of separation couldn't be entirely overcome. But the Henderson family had learned to accept these gaps as part of their story, rather than as barriers to their future connection. Michael's house became a gathering place for extended family events, a physical symbol of his commitment to remaining present in their lives. The spare bedroom was designated as Emma's room for college breaks, and Tyler often stayed overnight when his parents traveled for work. The house represented something that Michael had never possessed during his years of exile, a permanent address that was connected to other people's lives, rather than being a temporary stopping point in a life of perpetual transition. The most powerful testament to their healing came during Sarah's birthday in 2024, 6 years after Michael's return. For the first time since her death, David felt able to celebrate his mother's memory without the bitter overlay of unanswered questions about his father's disappearance. Michael joined David at Sarah's grave, bringing flowers and sharing stories about their early marriage that helped David understand his mother as a complete person, rather than just as the woman who had been left behind. As this epilogue is written in September 2025, the Henderson family continues to navigate the ongoing process of building relationships across the gap of lost time. Michael, now 72, has begun to face the health challenges that come with aging, but he faces them as part of a family rather than alone. David has learned to accept his father's mortality with the understanding that their reconciliation, while imperfect, was genuine and meaningful. Emma graduated from college in May 2025 and chose to take a job in Chicago, partly to remain close to her extended family. Tyler is beginning his senior year of high school and regularly includes his grandfather in his college planning conversations. Jennifer has watched her husband transform from a man haunted by abandonment into someone who can offer forgiveness without forgetting the lessons learned from pain. The Henderson family's story offers no simple moral about the power of forgiveness or the inevitability of healing. Instead, it demonstrates the complex, ongoing work required to rebuild trust after profound betrayal. Michael's return didn't erase the impact of his absence, but it did provide an opportunity for everyone involved to choose connection over resentment, growth over stagnation. Their reunion through a random video conference call remains a source of wonder for all of them, a reminder that sometimes the most significant moments in life arrive without warning, disguised as ordinary professional obligations. The technology that had separated people during the pandemic became, for the Hendersons, the bridge that brought them back together. 4 years later, Michael Henderson is no longer the ghost who haunted his family's history. He has become what he always had the potential to be, but had never allowed himself to become: a present father, a devoted grandfather, and a man who learned that courage sometimes means not leaving, but coming back and staying, even when staying requires facing the full weight of the damage caused by leaving. The story continues to unfold, not with dramatic revelations or perfect resolutions, but with the quiet persistence of people who choose, day after day, to love each other despite their histories and to build their futures on the foundation of hard-won understanding and carefully rebuilt trust.